In the grand, violent theater of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy wielded some of the most fearsome warships the world had ever seen. Names like Akagi, Kaga, and the mighty Yamato were spoken with a mix of awe and dread. These were titans purpose-built for destruction, the embodiment of Japan's martial ambition. But history is often shaped not by the titans, but by the overlooked, the underestimated, and the improvised. This is the story of an aircraft carrier that cheated death so many times, its enemies must have thought it was a ghost. It wasn't a ghost ship, it was just very, very lucky. And it began its life not as a weapon of war, but as a vessel of peace and luxury. Before it launched fighters and bombers, it was designed to launch champagne bottles. In the late 1930s, the Nippon Yusen Kaisha Shipping Line, or NYK, was planning to revolutionize trans-Pacific travel. They commissioned two new luxury ocean liners, the Kashiwara Maru and the Izumo Maru. These were to be magnificent vessels, symbols of Japanese engineering and hospitality, designed to ferry wealthy passengers between Yokohama and San Francisco in unparalleled comfort. The Kashiwara Maru was laid down at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki in May 1939, a steel promise of a glamorous future. The plans called for opulent suites, grand dining halls, and swimming pools. It was to be a floating palace, a testament to a world at peace. But even as its keel was laid, the world was sliding inexorably toward war. The Japanese government, already deep into its expansionist campaigns in China, was thinking far ahead. They provided a 60% subsidy for the construction of these liners with a secret and sinister condition. The ships had to be designed from the very beginning for rapid conversion into military vessels. The Navy had its eyes on them for a very specific purpose: auxiliary aircraft carriers. So while the blueprints showed ballrooms, they also included features like reinforced decks capable of supporting the immense stress of landing aircraft, space for dual engine rooms, and layouts that could easily accommodate aircraft elevators and hangars. The civilian passengers who might one day stroll its decks would have no idea they were walking on a future flight deck. A stage for one of history's bloodiest conflicts. The dream of the luxury liner Kashiwara Maru was a lie, a carefully constructed facade for a weapon in waiting. Construction proceeded, but the dream of peace was dying fast. By 1940, the clouds of war were gathering, and the pretense was dropped. The Navy officially purchased the half-completed liner. The luxurious fittings were scrapped, the grand halls were gutted, and the vessel was towed to Sasebo Naval Arsenal. The ship of peace was dead. A peregrine falcon was about to be born. The transformation from the Kashiwara Maru into the aircraft carrier Jun'yō, meaning peregrine falcon, was a masterpiece of wartime improvisation. The engineers and shipwrights at Sasebo faced a monumental task: turning a passenger ship's hull into a functional warship. It was a process defined by compromise. Unlike fleet carriers built from the keel up for combat, Jun'yō would have significant inherent weaknesses. The most glaring of these was its lack of armor. Its hull was that of a civilian vessel, vulnerable to torpedoes and bombs. There was no armored flight deck to protect the hangars below. The machinery spaces were likewise unprotected. A single well-placed torpedo could prove fatal. Another major compromise was its island superstructure. It was integrated with its funnel, a large, prominent structure canted 26 degrees to starboard. This was done to keep hot exhaust gases away from the flight deck, a common feature on carriers, but on Jun'yō, it created a massive, unarmored target. A direct hit here could cripple the ship's command and control. Despite these weaknesses, the conversion was thorough. 2 aircraft hangars were built, one stacked atop the other, and serviced by 2 elevators. The flight deck stretched over 623 feet, about 190 meters, long enough to operate the modern aircraft of the day. The propulsion system was a mix of old and new. The original liner turbines were retained, but paired with 6 powerful Kampon boilers, giving the ship a top speed of around 25 knots, or 46 kilometers per hour. This was slower than the 30-knot-plus fleet carriers of the Kido Butai, a critical disadvantage that meant it could not always keep pace with the main striking forces. It was a recurring problem that would dictate how the ship was used throughout its career. For defense, it was bristling with anti-aircraft guns, primarily 12 127mm dual-purpose guns and dozens of 25mm autocannons. Its air group was its true offensive punch. It could carry a complement of around 53 aircraft, a mix of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters for protection, Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, and Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers for offensive strikes. Commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy in May 1942, the Jun'yō and its sister ship, Hiyō, converted from the Izumo Maru, formed a new carrier division. They were not as glamorous or as powerful as the veterans of Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese Navy, having just suffered a catastrophic defeat at Midway, desperately needed every flight deck it could get. The Peregrine Falcon was ready to hunt. Just 1 month after its commissioning in June 1942, Jun'yō was thrown into its first major operation, a move designed as a strategic diversion. While the main Japanese fleet sailed for Midway Atoll, Jun'yō, along with the light carrier Ryūjō, was sent north to the icy fog-shrouded waters of the Aleutian Islands. Their mission was to attack the American base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island. The hope was that this strike would draw a portion of the American Pacific Fleet away from Midway, weakening the defense of the primary target. It was a brutal introduction to combat. The weather in the Aleutians was atrocious, a constant battle against freezing temperatures, dense fog, and violent winds. On June 3, Jun'yō launched its first-ever combat sortie. Its aircraft, 9 Zero fighters and 12 D-3A dive bombers, roared off the flight deck and disappeared into the gray sky. They found Dutch Harbor and delivered a sharp, stinging attack, bombing the radio station, oil storage tanks, and a barracks. The next day, they launched another strike, inflicting more damage on the American facilities. The attacks were successful on a tactical level, but they were a strategic failure. The Americans, thanks to their codebreakers, knew the main target was Midway and refused to take the bait. The Aleutian raid did not divert a single American ship. While Jun'yō's pilots were battling fog and flak in the north, the Kido Butai was sailing into a trap. 4 of Japan's finest fleet carriers were sunk at Midway, a devastating blow from which the Imperial Navy would never fully recover. Jun'yō returned from its first mission, having performed its duties flawlessly, but it came back to a navy that was suddenly, desperately on the back foot. The loss of the 4 carriers at Midway instantly elevated Jun'yō from a second-rate auxiliary to a front-line, vital asset. The improvised carrier now found itself at the heart of the Pacific War. The focus of the war now shifted south, to the sweltering jungles of Guadalcanal. The American landings there in August 1942 sparked a brutal, months-long campaign of attrition on land, at sea, and in the air. By October, the situation was at a crisis point. The Japanese planned a major offensive to throw the Americans off the island, and the combined fleet sailed to provide support and eliminate the U.S. Navy carriers operating in the area. Jun'yō, alongside the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, and the light carrier Zuiho, was part of this powerful force. What followed was the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, one of the most violent carrier versus carrier duels of the war. On October 26, the battle was joined. American and Japanese carrier aircraft swarmed the skies, each side desperate to land a knockout blow. Jun'yō launched its strikes against the American fleet, and its pilots claimed hits on the carrier USS Hornet. But the Americans hit back, and they hit back hard. Jun'yō was steaming under heavy cloud cover, which offered some protection. But eventually, the American dive bombers found it. A wave of SBD Dauntlesses from the USS Enterprise screamed down. 2 500-pound, 227-kilogram bombs slammed into Jun'yō's flight deck. The first bomb struck near the stern, tearing a gaping hole in the deck and causing minor damage. The second hit just forward of the island, creating a larger crater and inflicting more serious structural damage. The ship's speed was slightly reduced, and its flight operations were temporarily hampered. But the crew's damage control was magnificent. Despite the fires and the chaos, they worked feverishly to patch the holes and get the carrier back into the fight. The Peregrine Falcon was wounded, but its talons were still sharp. While it survived, the battle was costly for both sides. The American carrier Hornet was sunk, but the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuiho were also heavily damaged. More importantly, Japanese aircraft and, crucially, experienced pilot losses were staggering. Jun'yō had survived its first major fleet action, but it was a sobering taste of the brutal reality of the carrier war. It limped back to Japan for repairs, its flight deck scarred, but its crew more determined than ever. By mid-1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Japan. The Americans were on the offensive, island-hopping across the Pacific, their industrial might producing an overwhelming number of ships, aircraft, and trained pilots. The next major objective was the Mariana Islands, whose airfields would put American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. For Japan, this was a line that could not be crossed. The Imperial Navy gathered every available warship for one last decisive battle, an all-or-nothing gamble to annihilate the American fleet. Jun'yō was part of this fleet, which sailed to meet the Americans in the Philippine Sea. The resulting battle, fought on June 19 and 20, would become infamously known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was a complete and utter disaster for the Japanese. The Americans, equipped with superior aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and guided by advanced radar and experienced fighter directors, slaughtered the Japanese air groups. Untested, inexperienced Japanese pilots were shot down in droves. Jun'yō's air group was effectively wiped out, its pilots sacrificed in futile waves against an impenetrable wall of American firepower. On June 20, the American counterattack came. As dusk fell, planes from the USS Belleau Wood found Jun'yō. One bomb struck the carrier's island, causing significant damage. Moments later, a torpedo launched from a TBF Avenger slammed into its starboard side, near the forward engine room. The explosion tore a hole in its unarmored hull, and seawater rushed in. The ship took on a heavy list and its speed dropped. It seemed like the Falcon's flight was finally over. But once again, the ship refused to die. Its damage control teams, now seasoned veterans of chaos, managed to contain the flooding and correct the list. Crippled and trailing oil, Jun'yō managed to disengage and begin the long, slow journey back to Japan. The battle was a catastrophe. Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers, including Jun'yō's sister ship Hiyō, and over 600 aircraft. The naval air arm was shattered beyond recovery. Jun'yō had survived, but it was a hollow victory. The ship was saved, but its soul, its air group, was gone forever. By the autumn of 1944, Japan was desperate. The Americans were preparing to invade the Philippines, which would sever Japan's vital oil lifeline from the south. The Japanese High Command devised an incredibly complex and desperate plan, called Shogo 1, to defend the Philippines. It involved multiple fleets converging on the American invasion force at Lake Gulf. The plan had one final cynical trick up its sleeve: a decoy. With the Japanese naval air arm destroyed at the Philippine Sea, the remaining carriers were nothing more than hollow shells, flight decks with no planes. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was given command of this northern force, a fleet of carriers including the veteran Zuikaku and the battered but repaired Jun'yō. Their mission was suicidal: sail south from Japan and deliberately expose themselves to the American Third Fleet, commanded by Admiral William Bull Halsey. They were the bait, intended to lure Halsey's powerful carriers north, away from the San Bernardino Strait. This would, in theory, allow a powerful Japanese surface fleet of battleships and cruisers, led by the super battleship Yamato, to sneak through the strait and annihilate the American invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf. It was a plan born of utter desperation. Jun'yō and the rest of Ozawa's fleet played their part to perfection. On October 25, Halsey took the bait. Believing the northern force was the main Japanese threat, he turned his entire fleet north in pursuit, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. "I have them," he signaled, steaming full speed towards the decoy. Ozawa had succeeded. Now, all he and his men could do was try to survive the inevitable onslaught. American air attacks began in waves. The sky over the Japanese fleet turned black with hundreds of American dive bombers and torpedo planes. The Japanese carriers, with only a handful of aircraft for defense, were helpless. The flagship Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, was hit repeatedly and sank. The light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda were also sent to the bottom. Amidst the carnage, Jun'yō weaved and dodged, its anti-aircraft guns firing continuously. But its luck couldn't hold forever. A bomb struck its flight deck, causing more damage. Another near miss buckled its hull plates. Yet, compared to the other carriers, it was miraculously spared. As Ozawa's fleet was being annihilated, the main Japanese surface force passed through the unguarded strait and fell upon a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers in a heroic but mismatched action known as the Battle off Samar. The American sailors fought with incredible bravery, and the Japanese commander, Admiral Kurita, ultimately lost his nerve and retreated without pressing his advantage. The grand Japanese plan had failed. Jun'yō, battered and bruised, was one of the few ships of the decoy force to escape. It had served as bait in one of the largest naval battles in history and had, once again, limped home. After the Battle of Lake Gulf, Jun'yō was a carrier in name only. It had no air group and little prospect of getting one. The ship was relegated to the role of a fast transport ferrying supplies and personnel. In early December 1944, it was on a mission from Mako to Sasebo, carrying a cargo of munitions, when its luck finally seemed to run out. It was sailing through the East China Sea, escorted by the destroyer Maki and the cruiser Kiso. Stalking them was an American submarine wolf pack. The submarines, USS Sea Devil, Tuna, and Redfish had found their position and were closing in for the kill. Just after midnight on December 9, the attack came. The Redfish, commanded by Commander Louis D. McGregor, fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 of them found their mark. One torpedo slammed into Jun'yō's forward section. Another hit amidships. The third, and most devastating, struck the starboard engine room. The explosion was catastrophic. The engine room flooded almost instantly, killing many of the crewmen inside. The aft engine room also began to take on water. The ship lost all power and went dead in the water, taking on a severe 12-degree list to starboard. This was the blow that should have killed it. Any other ship, especially one with as little armor as Jun'yō, would likely have capsized and sunk within minutes. But the Peregrine Falcon was not just any other ship. The crew's damage control was nothing short of miraculous. Working in darkness, waist-deep in cold seawater, they fought to counter flood compartments on the port side. Slowly, painstakingly, they managed to correct the list. The ship was still afloat, but it was a crippled, helpless hulk. The submarine Tuna fired another spread of torpedoes, but in a final stroke of incredible luck, they all missed. The destroyer Maki managed to take the crippled carrier in tow. For days, they crawled across the ocean, a snail's pace journey back to Japan. Against all odds, the ship that should have been at the bottom of the sea made it back to the port of Sasebo. Jun'yō arrived at Sasebo Naval Arsenal as a ghost. It was a testament to the resilience of its crew, but the Japanese war effort was collapsing. The resources to repair such extensive damage, the raw materials, the skilled labor, the fuel, simply did not exist. An inspection revealed that repairing the ship would be a colossal undertaking, one that would divert precious resources from other, more critical tasks. The decision was made. The Peregrine Falcon would not be repaired. It would not fly again. For the remainder of World War II, Jun'yō sat moored at Ebisu Bay in Sasebo, a crippled, silent hulk. Its guns were stripped away to bolster the land defenses of the port. It was a sad, inglorious end for a ship that had fought so hard. It survived numerous air raids on the naval base, a passive observer to the final destruction of the navy it had served. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the ship was still there, rusty and derelict, a survivor to the very end. The story of Jun'yō is not one of glorious victories or decisive battles. It is a story of survival against impossible odds. It was a ship that was never supposed to be a warship, born from a lie. It was slower, weaker, and less protected than its peers. It was bombed, torpedoed, and written off for dead on multiple occasions. Yet, it endured. It fought from the frozen north to the tropical south, a constant presence in the Imperial Navy's fleet. In the end, it was broken up for scrap in 1946, its steel recycled for a nation trying to rebuild from the ashes of defeat. The Jun'yō was the ultimate workhorse, the improvised survivor, the lucky carrier that simply refused to die. And that's the incredible story of the Jun'yō. A ship's legacy is often written by its final battle. But sometimes the real story is in the journey itself. What piece of military history, legendary machine, or untold story should we investigate next? We read all of your suggestions, and your idea could very well be our next mission. Drop your mission briefing in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the lesser-known workhorses of the war, and you want to keep these stories alive, make sure you are subscribed. It's the best way to ensure you don't miss the next chapter in our exploration of military history. Thanks for watching.